the environmental conditions upon which we have and how we're treating the environment has profound implications on the health, security, and future of our species. And unless we drive environmental issues to the top of the table, then we're ignoring the undermining of our own survival.
Welcome to the Appian Project, a podcast dedicated to improving the skills of One Health practitioners. We use mental models, interviews, and more to teach you the skills you need to be an effective practitioner of the One Health approach. I'm your host, Danny Kalani. Before I get to introducing today's guest, I'd like to give a shout out to @OneHealthOHNO on Twitter for guessing the origin of the name of this podcast. If you want to learn more about the behind the scenes of this podcast, follow @Appian Project on Twitter. Today, we're joined by the Honourable Keith Martin, a former Canadian politician and Member of Parliament. In Parliament, Dr. Martin founded Canada's first all-party conservation caucus to promote conversations between academicians and members of Parliament. Dr. Martin is also a physician who has led the Consortium of Universities for Global Health since 2012 as its executive director. The consortium brings together over 170 academic institutions from around the world to strengthen academic global health programs and reduce global health inequities. Currently, Dr. Martin is also a commissioner on the Lancet-ISMMS Commission on Pollution, Health, and Development. Our conversation revolves around lessons we can learn from Dr. Martin's expertise in capacity building in the context of global health, as well as initiatives in low-income environments that jointly address conservation, environmental sustainability, and human health. Thank you so much, Keith Martin, for joining me on the show today.
My pleasure, Danny. Great to be here.
So I'm just going to start off with an opening question that kind of gets into when environmental health started to become more prominent in your approach. I've noticed that you're quite well voiced on the issues of conservation and environmental health in the context of global health. So when did that really start to click in for you?
Well, it started back in believe it or not, in the mid-1980s. At that time, I was working in South Africa during apartheid in a black hospital. And the hospital was located north of Swaziland and south of Kruger Park. So I had an opportunity to exercise something that's been a passion of mine since, quite frankly, since I was a child, is conservation. And I would have the great opportunity to go into Kruger Park and then subsequently traveling south into what is now KwaZulu-Natal, north of Durban, and frankly being able to volunteer with the conservation officers. So I had a chance to go around and see the work that they were doing, but importantly looking at the communities that lived around these parks that harbored incredible biodiversity. And these communities, Danny, were desperately poor. And yet the private parks in particular were generating vast sums of money that were not being appropriately shared, and is still not appropriately shared to this day with the surrounding communities. And I just saw a great opportunity to be able to not only protect ecosystems, but also enable communities that were desperately poor and who wanted to manage their ecosystems in a sustainable way to be able to do that, but also share in the revenues from that. So essentially a balanced, or as we now know, a One Health approach towards improving and addressing our environmental challenges, as well as improving human health.
That's really impressive. And I imagine that the money being brought in from those parks would kind of drive the whole One Health approach further, in the sense that there's a lot of interconnection between the people living there and, I suppose, efforts towards conservation.
That's exactly right. If it's done properly, you could have a sustainable situation where you're living within what we know are the ecosystem services that environments can provide, generating resources, not only money, but also jobs, which pay for housing and healthcare and infrastructure for people's needs, education, and also for food for people. And it can be done in a very sustainable manner. So, but I still think to this day that opportunity is not, we don't take advantage of it enough. In other words, we don't do a good enough job of mainstreaming conservation into development. And that's what I saw as far back as the 1980s, this incredible opportunity. And speaking to the impoverished communities that were living near these wildlife refuges, the people would say to me, look, we can manage these areas. We want to share the resources, but we also want to manage them properly and appropriately. And that's an opportunity that to this day, as I mentioned, is low-hanging fruit, and being able to not only improve the social determinants of health, but also address critical challenges to ecosystem hotspots, to biodiverse areas. And in fact, if for your listeners, if they want to take a look, I really encourage them to look at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They have identified what they call biodiversity hotspots, and those hotspots harbor the vast majority of a good chunk, should I say, of the world's biodiversity. Now, the other interesting thing about this is that people who live near a lot of those biodiverse hotspots are indigenous peoples who use who need those ecosystems for their culture, for their food, as part embedded within their religious beliefs. But those communities and those ecosystems together are under significant threat, and we're certainly seeing this now, whether we're talking about Brazil and the devastation taking place in the Amazon basin, or in the Congo basin, or in West Africa. And indigenous peoples are some of the most impoverished people in the world, and are under significant threat, as are the ecosystems that they live near.
That's really eye-opening. Can you tell us about some of the initiatives that you're currently or you've finished working on that jointly improve human and environmental health?
Well, what we're doing right now, Danny, is we're aggregating what works. So, what initiatives work, what programs work that can have the dual benefit of improving not only health outcomes and address the social determinants of people's lives, but also enable us to have a positive impact upon the environment. There's something, again, another thing that your viewers or your listeners may wish to look at is something called Earth Overshoot Day. And that day is calculated as the day in the year where our world global population essentially uses up all of the ecosystem services that the planet produces. That day is marching earlier and earlier and earlier in the calendar, which means that gap between what the planet can produce for us versus what we're using is widening all the time. And we have to deal with that. Otherwise, we're going to be in an increasingly critical problem. So we're identifying the solutions, but also what the rate of return of those solutions are. And in fact, we're taking we'll use those solutions as part of our advocacy efforts. And we created an advocacy platform here in the United States that enable us to mobilize academia to engage with policymakers, both at a federal and a state level, to show what works in terms of dealing with these challenges. Because right now, environmental issues are not only not on a lot of people's plate, but also is here in the United States, they're under significant threat. So we have a problem with the Environmental Protection Agency rules and regulations are being eliminated or neutralized, and that's going to have a very big impact here. But also, of course, we have networks around the world of colleagues in over 35 countries, and we'll work with them to identify what some of the solutions are and to share with them and side with them in their advocacy efforts. When I was in Parliament, we created a conservation caucus, for the first actually conservation caucus in the Canadian Parliament. I started that up because I wanted to find a way to bring scientists to meet parliamentarians. So this was an all-party caucus. We had members from all parties who'd come together, and I would invite them to identify different topics we should deal with and bring in scientists to share with them what some of the big issues were. And this includes members of the International Panel for Climate Change, individuals involved in trying to stop wildlife trafficking, others from the World Wildlife Fund doing great work on environmental degradation, top scientists looking at changes in the Arctic, water security, ocean health. Dr. Sylvia Earle we brought in. It was a good way, and I would encourage anybody who is involved in politics in different parts of the world to really create some mechanism where scientists can actually come and meet politicians of all political stripes and share with them what some of the things they can be doing to address the big environmental and health challenges we face today, that One Health approach that you're advocating for.
And that sounds like a really great initiative to try and bring academia into policy. But let's also look at the other end. So, what strategies can One Health practitioners in academia who might be experts in their field equip themselves with to better inform politicians and policy?
Well, we have two solitudes, Danny. One is academia, and the other, well, there's actually three solitudes. Academia sits out in one bucket, and then you've got the public and policymakers in another bucket. They don't speak the same language. They don't really understand each other. And politicians don't need academia, but they do need politicians and the public to really implement what their research produces. I'll take a look at the academicians for initially, is that they need to understand what the motives and incentives are for politicians. They need to understand that their timeline is longer. Most politicians are not scientists. The politicians have many, many, many things on their table. So academicians have to figure out how do people from academia, how do you get the issue you're trying to advocate for? How do you get that and put that at the top of people's table on to their attention? So you've got to, when you meet with them, you have to communicate in their language, give them something that's useful and helpful, show them why it works, how it works, what is the cost, what's the opportunity cost of not doing something, and then offer to help them in a nonpartisan way. So the academic world doesn't do that very well. And we need to change that, as we're seeing certainly now with the COVID-19 pandemic. There is ever more need now for scientists to speak up, for scientists to become public scientists, and to match the production of research with an even greater zeal to implement it. Because if you're just trying to deliver research, that has a benefit, but the bigger benefit is actually getting that research into policies that are implemented. So it's up to the academic world to really reach out and understand in a better way how politicians communicate, what their incentives are, what their timelines are, and their timelines are short. The timeline for them is getting elected or reelected. So you have to understand that when you're dealing with the political world. And don't forget the public, because we tend to forget engaging with the public. Now, why that's important, particularly now, is that we're certainly seeing a much greater effort for the spread of false information, for the spread of information or messages that undermine science and the scientific community. And that's creating doubt in the minds of the public and affecting what their decisions and behavior is. And nothing's more obvious than that than, of course, the anti-vaccination movement, which is having tragically an effective outcome for them in reducing the number of children that are being vaccinated. And that's going to be a terrible price for children and society. So scientists need to get into the game and start figuring out now how to act as a strong public and effective counterpoint to those that are spreading this destructive disinformation.
Definitely. It sounds like playing an active role in informing the public is quite important, aside from strictly publishing scientific papers, maybe moving more into the, I suppose, mass media, that sort of thing. What do you think on that?
I think you're right, Danny. It's not good enough to simply talk about what you're doing amongst your colleagues. We tend to do that, and that's understandable. It perhaps is a little frightening and maybe uncomfortable to be able to reach out to others, but we need to do that. I mean, there was a very interesting study that was done by our good colleague, Dr. Peter Hotez. Dr. Hotez is in Baylor University, and he's a world famous, he's the dean of tropical medicine there and an expert on vaccines, vaccinology, and he's done a great work of actually acting as a voice against the ridiculous comments that are made and the false comments that vaccines cause autism, which has been thoroughly debunked. So he did a study and showed that, in fact, a very small percentage of people in academia write blogs, write op-ed pieces, engage the media, or engage the public through the media. So that was just a very observable evidence to show that we must do a much better job of engaging the public and policymakers.
Definitely. And I suppose a little bit more broadly to the newer One Health practitioners that might be still doing their training or are just getting started. Do you have any advice for them as they're entering the, I suppose, the real world of health problems?
There are a number of practical skills that we found that employers in global health, One Health, and global health in particular, they're finding that graduates do not have. And those things, Danny, revolve around skills such as project management, communication, leadership, team building, statistics, communication, as I mentioned, understanding political systems, not understanding political science, but to writ large, but being sensitive to and understanding the political environment you're in, whether it's a big P political system or a smaller political system, because you have to know how to navigate those environments if you're going to be able to move things forward. But of all the things that I think that if there's one skill set that I would encourage anybody to acquire, whether you're in One Health or in medicine or anything else, it's really project management. That's probably the top of the list.
And what opportunities do you see for students to go about acquiring those skills, say in a university setting?
You can take those an elective, or you can actually, even just doing it online gives you some ability to manage projects, to understand finance in a very practical way. So if it doesn't suit, if it's not convenient, and if you're not able to do it within the context of your studies, then please try to take it as an online course, so at least you start to understand how to manage a project. Because regardless of what you do, whether you are managing your own practice, if you're a veterinarian or a physician, or whether you are involved in working with a non-governmental organization or in government or in the private sector, having good, strong project management skills is very, very important. In fact, the American Medical Association, I'm in Washington, D.C. now, but the American Medical Association, certainly there was an article that they said, despite how busy medical students are, we really need to find a way in which medical students can strengthen their project management skills. And I would extend that to anybody going into the work world.
And in the past few years, what new habit, belief, or behavior has most improved your life?
Well, what I've strived to do, Danny, is in fact try to be kinder and more compassionate and understanding. I don't know whether I'm successful at that, but there's a coarsening of society, at least from my you know viewpoint here, about 3/4 of a kilometer north of the White House. There's a coarsening of society that's happening, and in that we all lose. So I've just made a conscious decision myself to try to be kinder, more compassionate and understanding, and hopefully a better listener. But that's always aspirational, and all we can do is do our best.
Definitely. I think empathy is a skill that we could all continue to work on and improve throughout our lives.
Indeed, absolutely.
And back in 2009, you urged for the founding of the Centers for International Health and Development at Canadian universities to help in reducing international inequalities that a lot of low income countries are facing right now. Would you mind telling us more about this?
Well, what I thought, Danny, is that right now I'm the executive director of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health, and this is a consortium of academic institutions. But in fact, before even 2009, back in the early to mid 2000s, I had actually went to the Gates Foundation and suggested to them that they may want to create a consortium of academic institutions involving Canadian and American institutions and others that can come together and collaborate to deal with, as you mentioned, inequalities that low income countries are facing, and work with institutions in low income countries to essentially build capacity with them in a sensitive and responsible manner. So what I'm sitting here now at the Consortium of Universities for Global Health is something that I'd actually advocated for back over 15 years ago with the Gates Foundation and of course Parliament. So I still think that that's still remains a great opportunity to advance this.
How can universities continue to advance these sorts of initiatives?
There's the Canadian Consortium for Global Health Research, and that's a partner of ours, in fact. And they're doing a very good job of coming together around the research component. There's CSIH, there's also the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, CIFAR in Toronto. So that's part of the picture. I still think for here in the US or in Canada or around the world, there still needs to be an effort to try to do a better job of mobilizing the assets in academia and connect them to dealing with global health challenges. And those challenges can be right in your backyard. We did a webinar recently with representatives from Baltimore and Flint, Michigan, New Orleans, and the Navajo, a person speaking about the plight of First Nations on the Navajo reserve here in the US, which is quite bleak. There's a real need and an opportunity to challenge academia and to create incentives for faculty and for graduate students in particular to be able to engage with communities near them. And in terms of one specific area is to do what I call service learning. So you provide a supervised service as a senior trainee, and also in the process, you're able to learn as well as do research. To give you an example, I was speaking at the American Association of Veterinary Medical Colleges, and I was walking by the posters, and there was a dental student. I stopped and I said to her, "Tell me please about your poster." And she said, "Well, what we did is that they partnered with vet students and the veterinary college. So the veterinary students would go into low-income communities that would never be able to access vet care for their pets. They love their pets, so they welcome the senior vet students in to do basic animal care and perform some procedures on them as necessary. But in addition, they also brought in final year dental students, and those dental students under supervision would provide oral health care for people who could never afford this. So imagine if you've got senior vet students, veterinary students, you've got senior dental students. You can put nurses in there, medical students in there, you could put law students in there. You could combine whatever you need to create really interesting opportunities for students to learn under supervision, but provide services under supervision. It's a win-win situation. So those are the kind of things you need to do, but academia doesn't have right now the incentives to do that. So we need to reform tenure. We need to reform the incentives and how individuals are judged to acquire tenure, to put in things like, are you building capacity? Are you engaged in service learning opportunities? Are you speaking out in the media and engaging the media? Do you help low-income communities abroad? Do you work with them to write grants and to enable them to get grants? There's a lot of different things you can build into it. But the bottom line is I think we need to think through and look at impact. And what are the things that we need to build into tenure reform so that we can fully realize the capacity and the power of academia? And I'll leave one last thing is a really important area is in the translation of research, as I mentioned before. If you're just judged by the number of grants you get, or if you're being judged by the number of papers you produce, I think that doesn't do service to the research that's produced. If we build in incentives to translate that research and find ways for academia to collaborate with NGOs, governments, and others to translate their research, I think academia will have a greater impact, but also it'll drive resources to them too. So again, it could be a win-win situation.
It sounds like incentivization is the way to go forward. And you mentioned capacity building, which I personally see as one of the most important long-term goals for global health. What do you think are some of the biggest mistakes that are being made with capacity building?
That's a very good question, Danny. So I think structurally speaking, the way in which capacity building efforts are structured, when they are structured, the timelines are too short. I don't think there's sufficient attention made to include the partners from your overseas colleagues into the decision-making process right from the beginning and all the way through. What is done must, as we know, they must be the ones who actually lead what is being done, why is it being done, who is it being done to, so the power imbalances are not taken into consideration. The structures are not built appropriately to ensure that your LMIC, low to middle income country colleagues, or low to middle income environment colleagues are often not properly included. Power imbalances are not taken into consideration, and the timelines are far too short. Sometimes timelines they're looking at 1 year, 2 year to do something that in any country would take a decade at the very least. So we need to look at that. And finally, we need to look at the retention of the capacity that's built. You can build capacity, but can you retain it? And in that, you need to look at the political support, the financial support that's existing within the community that you're looking at. If they don't have long-term political buy-in and capital that's being invested in political capital, then you're probably not going to see an effective capacity building effort come to fruition and for that capacity to be retained, which is critically important.
In countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they have destabilized governments, is it common to see a lot of the expertise that's built kind of move away from the country as the conflict builds?
Absolutely, and that's just human nature. If people or their families are threatened, they're going to leave. Why should they stay? I was writing something recently, and it had to do with mental health and human resources deficits. And mental health is a global challenge, but access to human resources in that area, like in many, is there deep deficits. One example I just cited was in Liberia, which endured a terrible, brutal civil conflict and an Ebola epidemic. There are only 2 psychiatrists for 4 million people. I mean, not only do you have a population in deep need of such care, but you also have an incredible deficit. So there is the challenge of fragile environments or countries that are destabilized, is that the foundation upon which any sustainable development can occur, which are strong, effective public institutions, are not there. So you can't build long-term capacity in a fragile environment and retain it if the domestic public institutional capacity isn't there. All you can do in that environment is perhaps work with actors that can help to provide relief for people in the short to intermediate term. But the long-term capacity building can really only occur once a government is in place that's willing to build that capacity and build the public institutions that really form the foundation of development.
Right. And do you think there's any way to go about mitigating this sort of issue? Maybe potentially with partnerships with groups such as the United Nations peacekeeping or something to that extent?
Well, if you're talking about conflict prevention, then you're looking at reform of the Security Council, because frequently the permanent members of the Security Council block the ability of the UN to move forward to actually prevent some horrific situations from occurring. And I would only draw your attention now, to what's happening in Syria as one overt example. So we've seen that happen over and over and over again. And the Democratic Republic of the Congo is a good example, because you have a failed government in essence. And as a result of that, they cannot provide the security that citizens require in their country. So you have many, many bands of roaming groups that commit atrocities against the citizens of that country. Not to get into it, but there's also obviously a lot of external interference on the part of regional countries and also high-income countries that are profiteering off the incredible wealth of that country.
And I suppose we also have a similar issue where a lot of the expertise moves out of areas that really need it in Canada, but we don't have that issue with a destabilized government. Is there a way to mitigate that when we don't have the same issues, for example, with First Nations communities, rural areas, and healthcare?
There are, and I think it's getting back to incentives, creating incentives for people to work in those environments, creating opportunities for people to train from those environments and go back to those environments. So people from First Nations communities can train and then go back to their communities to provide the services that they need. When I talk about, if you're standing back and looking at what you actually need to develop sustainable development, you really, as I mentioned, need institutions, public institutions that are accountable to the public. And those are not only ministries of health, but you've got to have ministries of finance and justice, public works, the environment, education, housing, and you need independent oversight mechanisms that can actually hold governments to account and share that information through a free and open media to the public. Once you start severing that relationship or interfering with the relationship between the public's ability to hold elected officials to account, then you really are on the path to a destabilized environment with regard to that region or that country. As an example of just in the last 24 hours, there was a report, I think it was UNICEF, about the situation in northeast Nigeria, where Boko Haram has been operating. Now, Nigeria is the largest economy, and I'm not picking on Nigeria, but just as an example, Nigeria is the largest economy on the continent of Africa. In the northeast area of Nigeria, 40% of the children are malnourished. 40%. So that has profound implications for those children's lives in terms of their cognitive capabilities, future risks for non-communicable diseases, early death. And that's an abysmal failure on the part of the government in the capital, in Abuja, to be able to exercise its responsibilities as a federal government to work with the states to provide the security and needs that people have. So failed states lead to terrible outcomes for people.
Definitely, definitely. And looking more towards social determinants of health and your background in Canadian politics, why do you think that substantial funding is given to healthcare relative to initiatives that directly address social determinants of health or public health?
That's a great question, Danny. I think part of it is many people see healthcare as the care that you receive when you're sick, as opposed to looking at public health preventative measures. And we don't do a good enough job of articulating how important those social determinants of health are to people's lives. And in fact, if we don't deal with the social determinants of health, which are much cheaper, you wind up paying a lot more later on for dealing with the acute consequences of that. So I don't think the advocacy efforts are loud enough. People don't see the consequences easily of not having access to proper housing, proper education, public health initiatives. Those preventative initiatives are less dramatic than somebody's inability to be able to have their heart attack dealt with. So the preventative side is more difficult for people to see, but I also think that we're not doing a good enough job of advocating for it properly. The strength of the advocacy tends not to be as vocal nor as persistent as other elements that are better organized for the acute care health sector.
I guess the apparency of the cause and effect relationship between a treatment and getting better is more apparent than public health and keeping people healthy.
And it can be quite dramatic if you're absolutely correct. To cite just another example, not now to pick on not to pick on India, but I think it might be really shocking for your listeners to know that hypertension is fairly prevalent in India, but only 5% of those who have hypertension and need treatment are actually getting the appropriate treatment and are under control. That's staggering when you think about it. Here in the United States, because of the really grossly inefficient healthcare system that's been created here and how fractured it is, a lot of people, even with health insurance, cannot get their basic health needs. For example, diabetics, people who are of modest means, are actually rationing their insulin because they can't afford the insulin they need to manage their diabetes. Now imagine what the consequences of that are. If we were to be, I mean, not only humane about it and do the right thing, but from a medical perspective, you do not, under any circumstances, want to put people in a position where they have to ration their insulin. But that's what people are doing in this country. And that's the richest country in the world that spends more than anybody else on healthcare.
Definitely, I've heard about the effects of poorly controlled diabetes and how that can have quite devastating health effects. Moving towards current events, what's a lesson that you think government officials worldwide should be taking away from the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think, Danny, that they need to, and this is a message that we've been doing here at the consortium, is that yes, the COVID-19 pandemic is a health problem, but it's actually an environmental problem. That's where its roots are. So the SARS coronavirus 2 virus that causes COVID-19, the disease, jumped from some animal. Maybe it was bats, maybe it was civet cats. We don't really know at this point in time, but it jumped from an animal to a person. And like, that's where 70% of infectious diseases are coming from. They're leaping from a non-human species to humans. And why that's happening is we are coming in contact more and more with wild spaces as we destroy environments. As we destroy environments and as people start to consume wildlife more, they're stocked in unhealthy wet markets. And as a consequence, you get this mushing together of fluids, which is a ideal environment for viruses to mutate into something lethal and for that virus to spill over from an animal to a human. And that's what we saw with COVID-2. We saw it with the Nipah virus. We saw it with Ebola, HIV. 70% of infectious diseases, in fact, emerging infectious diseases, come from animals. So policymakers need to see that. I think the genesis of this talk that we're having, Danny, is that policymakers need to understand that the environmental conditions upon which we have and how we're treating the environment has profound implications on the health, security, and future of our species. And unless we drive environmental issues to the top of the table, then we're ignoring the undermining of our own survival. That's not what we talk about, I think, well enough, even whether it's climate change or biodiversity losses, environmental degradation, pollution. We don't frame it well enough. And we need to do that. And scientists need to speak out about this. So, if we're not, then we're actually, COVID-19 is not the last pandemic we'll have, and it's not the only environmental challenge that's going to have profound impacts upon people's health. The, the other side of this coin is that if you actually, as I mentioned earlier, mainstream conservation efforts into development initiatives, you can actually get the double benefit of not only improving environmental outcomes, but you're going to have a profound impact on preventing a lot of health issues, particularly the non-communicable diseases, because there's a lot of evidence that shows that time spent in nature can have a profound impact upon mental health outcomes, cardiovascular issues, diabetes, and other challenges.
It sounds like the interconnections between health and the environment are something that we can continue to build a greater appreciation for over time.
And exactly right. I mean, I sit on the Lancet Commission for Pollution and Health, and another, quite disregarded issue is the fact that pollution contributes to 9 million preventable deaths every year. That's the leading cause of preventable deaths in the world. And a lot of that pollution is preventable. And in fact, a lot of that pollution takes place in low and middle income countries. So there's an equity issue embedded in this too. Pollution affects the poor. As we see with COVID-19 outcomes, I think we're all aware that the mortality and morbidity associated with COVID-19 hits people of color and the poor much more than others. And I think COVID-19 has also shone a light on socioeconomic disparities that have put people at risk for this particular virus, but also obviously their outcomes for a range of issues, particularly non-communicable diseases, which are responsible for 70% of deaths worldwide, is a very, very serious and neglected challenge.
And getting towards the end of our chat here, the Consortium of Universities for Global Health has numerous resources on its website, cugh.org. Where would you recommend future global health practitioners start?
I think, Danny, what I'd recommend for global health practitioners, take a look at our website, look at our educational products, which our educational committees and subcommittees have done a really good job pulling that material together. Look at our previous websites, tune into our future websites that you'll get information on at www.cugh.org. We put out a COVID-19 bulletin every week right now, and we have a monthly bulletin that comes out towards the middle of the month. And I would encourage global health practitioners to sign up, get that those bulletins, so you can be aware of a lot of the activities taking place around the world in global health.
And is there anything else you want to promote to our listeners?
Well, thanks, Danny. I just would like to encourage people to attend our conference. We have an annual conference. This year it was canceled, obviously, because of the pandemic. But next year we were slated to be in Houston, Texas from March 11th to the 14th. We will open up the website for people to join sometimes towards the middle to the end of next month. So we encourage people to come to Houston. We'll have hopefully up to 2,000 people in attendance from more than 60 countries, if all goes well. So we encourage people to attend to that. And I mentioned the webinars and bulletins that you can get at cugh.org. And if you're not a member of CUGH, if your institution is not a member, academic institutions or other organizations, NGOs that are interested in being involved in our global health work, please join. And you can see that again on our website, how to join at cugh.org. And Danny, I want to thank you very much for your time and foresight in running these podcasts. And I wish you all the very best of luck in your future studies.
No worries. Thanks so much, Keith, for being on the show. I really appreciate it, and I think you've brought a lot of value to listeners today.
Well, thanks for your time, Danny, and much thanks to your listeners to tune into your podcast.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of The Appian Project. New starting this week, if you leave a review on Apple Podcasts, you have a chance of having it read on future episodes. This week's review is by Skywalker122. If you're looking to learn about the hidden issues, causes, and other COVID-19 concerns, and perhaps other pandemics, this is the perfect podcast. I particularly enjoy how the host, Danny, digs into each topic by asking his guests questions from different perspectives, which helps me gain a better understanding of the value of the One Health approach. Thanks for the review. This is exactly what I was hoping listeners would be getting out of the podcast. There are more great interviews coming up, but until next time, this has been the Appian Project.